The US Court of Appeals ruled last week that separating school bathrooms based on biological sex is constitutional and does not violate Title IX, which prohibits sex-based discrimination. The ruling, which could have major implications in the states, held that a Florida school board didn't violate any equal protection rights when it prohibited transgender student Drew Adams from using the boys' bathrooms at Allen D. Nease High School. Joining me from Washington, D.C. to discuss this ruling, I'm delighted to welcome the author Kara Dansky, who wrote The Abolition of Sex, How the Transgender Agenda Harms Women and Girls. Good evening, Kara.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Now, Kara, I want to ask you first about this ruling. How do you feel about it?
It's a great ruling. This is the first time a U.S. Federal Court of Appeals has ruled that schools may maintain single-sex bathrooms consistent with, as you say, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So it's a really great decision.
And what will the later ramifications of this decision be? I mean, this seems to be a debate that is really sort of kicking off over in the States. Do you think other states will follow suit, or is this something that will now apply throughout the country?
So currently, the only states that are affected by the ruling are the states that exist within the 11th Circuit, which are Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. However, it is very likely that a case like this will go up to the Supreme Court because 3 courts of appeals have ruled that it's permissible for schools to maintain bathrooms based on a student's gender identity. And this conflicts with that. And that creates what is known in the states as a circuit split. And that's one of the factors that the Supreme Court considers in deciding whether to take a case. So it's very likely that one of these cases will make its way up to the Supreme Court. And we should hear relatively soon, within the next couple of years at least, what the Supreme Court thinks about whether schools can maintain single-sex spaces consistent with the law and with the Constitution.
It strikes me that a lot of this has come about because of a confusion between the definition of sex and the definition of gender identity, almost as though the two things are being conflated. But surely, isn't the law quite clear about this, that biological sex is something that is real and is necessary to preserve sex-based rights?
So we had a case in 2020 from the Supreme Court called Bostock versus Clayton County. And what the Supreme Court decided in that case is that it is employment discrimination, unlawful employment discrimination on the basis of sex for an employer to discriminate against a person on the basis of either sexual orientation or transgender status. It did not tell us what transgender status might mean. So that was decided in June of 2020. Immediately upon taking office, the President Biden, in January of 2021, announced to the country and to all federal agencies that everyone now had to start redefining the word sex to include gender identity for all purposes, which in my view is a complete misreading and misconstruing of the decision in Bostock versus Clayton County. I do not like the outcome of Bostock versus Clayton County, and we could discuss why. But even so, the Biden administration has been essentially lying to the American people since January of 2021 about what that decision says. And yes, absolutely, we are seeing across the country a complete reconfiguring of the category sex to include the nebulous, vacuous phrase gender identity by the Biden administration in complete contravention to accepted standards of law.
It reminds me of our National Health Service over here. There was a situation where they implemented single-sex accommodation in hospitals, but interior memos from the NHS said that they actually meant gender identity, but they were going to use the word sex so the public didn't get confused. But surely we need some sort of clarity on this. I mean, is there anything that feminist campaigners in America like yourself can do to make this clear, not just in terms of the public consciousness, but also in terms of legislation?
So we do this frequently. So I am the president of the U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International, and we have filed some court briefs before the federal judiciary explaining the importance of maintaining sex as a discrete category, explaining the importance of the category female to mean exclusively women and girls. And we have repeatedly written to Congress. The Congress is currently considering something called the Equality Act. Our version of the Equality Act is very different from the UK's version of the Equality Act. I just want to make that clear. In the UK, my understanding is the Equality Act does maintain sex as a discrete category, which is great. Our version of the Equality Act would completely annihilate that and redefine the word sex to include the phrase gender identity for all purposes under U.S. civil rights law, and that's disastrous. And we have worked very hard to communicate with various members of Congress at as much as we can since 2015 to explain why this would be a disaster for American women and girls. The U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International also in January of 2022 sent every single member of Congress a copy of my book, The Abolition of Sex. So they know that redefining sex to include gender identity is really bad for women and girls, especially and including lesbians. And it's really bad because it denies the material reality of biological sex, which is a disaster for all of us.
I mean, you are right to point out that the UK Equality Act does protect sex, not gender. But a lot of activist groups who are instructing people in schools and the police and that kind of thing deliberately misinterpret that as gender identity, not sex. And they conflate that deliberately in order to advance the agenda. But there are such serious ramifications for this, particularly when it comes to, let's say, prisons. And I know that in America there have been a number of examples of male-bodied individuals, even people who have committed sexual offences, being transferred to women's prisons. What's happening there at the moment in relation to that story?
So as far as I'm concerned, this should absolutely be a national scandal. And I am appalled at the U.S. media for not making it one. You're right. As you say, there are convicted male rapists and murderers being housed in women's prisons. And this is all over the country. I don't want people to be confused and think that this is only happening in, lefty California. It is happening in California, and it's a disaster. And it's happening in Washington state, but it's also happening in places like Illinois, Kentucky, New Jersey. It's happening all over the country. We know from hearing from women inside prisons that women have been raped, women have been sexually assaulted. They are standing watch over each other in order to protect each other from the men who are invading the women's prisons. We know that there are 2 women who got impregnated in a New Jersey prison because of men being housed in the women's prison on the basis of their so-called gender identity. And what I think is really important about that is to note that because we know that those inmates impregnated female inmates, we know that they are not any form of women. They are not trans women. They are not transgender women. We are just talking about men.
And this is the point, isn't it? That no one's saying that trans people have an inherently more predatory nature. What they're saying is gender self-identification will obviously be open to exploitation by people with a nefarious agenda.
So when I talk about this stuff, I'm just really interested in talking about men and women as discrete sex classes. And for me, it's not helpful to acknowledge that there's some third category of people who are neither male or female. And so every single person on the face of the planet is either female or male. And I just don't accept the rest of it.
So your view is that we should effectively just prioritise biology, particularly when it comes to prisons. And I suppose you would extend that to, well, sporting events are the obvious example. And that kind of thing, hasn't that led to more and more people being aware of the problem? Because when you see someone like the swimmer Leah Thomas standing on the top of a podium, towering over the other candidates, that surely it's difficult to sort of explain that away.
So Leah Thomas woke up a lot of Americans. So thank you, Will Thomas. Yes, I absolutely think that making these cases very obvious is very important. Part of the reason I do think it's so important to focus on biology is that it's not a mystery as to why women in this country were not allowed to vote until 1920. It's not a mystery as to why women were not allowed to serve on juries or have our own credit cards or divorce our own husbands. There's a reason that women have been treated horrifically throughout at least American society for hundreds of years. And that is not anything to do with identity. It's not anything to do with preferred pronouns. It's because we are women. It is because we are adult human females. And I'm not particularly interested in now turning around and pretending as though that category of human beings doesn't exist.
Why is it you think that people are so frightened to speak out about this particular issue? Why is it that you think, everyone knows that no human being has ever changed sex? And therefore, that is a fact that should just generally be acknowledged surely by everyone in authority. And that does have ramifications for the way in which you legislate in certain areas. Why are people not speaking out more about this? Well, when you tell people about the prison situation or the sports situation, most people are outraged.
Yeah, and I think it's true that still huge swaths of the American population have absolutely no idea. How that's possible is a mystery to me because I've been tapped into this since 2014. But I do think a lot of people really don't know. Maybe just people aren't paying attention. And you're right that once people are made aware of it, they are absolutely outraged. I do just want to say that when we talk about people, if we're talking about ordinary average Americans, I think it's fair to say that most people don't know. If we're talking about the leaders of the Democratic Party, which is the party to which I have always belonged and still belong, they know. And the Democratic Party, my party leaders, have been completely captured by this. And it's very frustrating. But I will also say that the Republican Party has been either unable or unwilling to stand up and take a stand against it. I'd be curious to know how that plays out in the UK. I do follow and I watch what the Labour Party is doing and I watch what your Labour leader has to say on this topic. But the more conservative party, at least in my country, is not taking a stand against it either.
No, that's right. I mean, here, the Labour Party, of course they are fully aware of the situation, but Keir Starmer has struggled to define what a woman is, as have many members of the Labour Party, but also members of the Conservative Party. And like you say, it's not the case that they can't be aware of this, because surely it should be their job to do some basic research. In Scotland, with Nicola Sturgeon's SNP, when feminists have said that there are serious consequences to housing men in women's prisons, etc., she says that those arguments have no merit. She just dismisses it. Now, can it be the case that people at that level of authority simply don't understand the issues? Or is it that they're being disingenuous? And if so, why?
I think they're being disingenuous. I think in my country, the Democrats are being disingenuous because they're paid to be so. There's a tremendous amount of money behind this movement. And when I say this movement, I mean the movement to abolish sex and enshrine gender identity throughout the law. And it is my belief that the Democratic Party has been bought and paid for and is going to keep continuing to push this until someone holds them account. Like I said, I don't think the Republicans are willing or able at this point to hold them to account. My even bigger frustration is with the media, because our media has also been completely captured. And if we could shine some light, and if we could have an honest conversation about what's going on in the American mainstream media, I think average, ordinary Americans across the political spectrum would be absolutely outraged. I hear from rank and file Democrats every day on social media, in my inbox. Rank and file Democrats, traditional leftist liberals in America, are absolutely outraged, but we cannot get a voice in most mainstream media outlets.
OK, well, lots to think about there. Cara, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.